All right, well, thank you everyone for coming, and it's a huge pleasure to be here. This is the first time I've visited Africa, and let alone been invited to speak in Africa. I'm from the north of England, so it's nice that Stellenbosch has brought the weather out to make me feel comfortable and at home as well, so that's marvellous. So a little bit about me. I mean, you heard a bit of an introduction there. I'm the co-founder of the Merseyside Skeptics Society, which is a voluntary group that's set up in the UK to be a skeptics in a pub kind of event. But we also had this activist mentality from the start that we want to try and affect the nonsense that's around us. And a lot of the times when I give talks, I tend to talk about the undercover investigations I've done, going in to see sidekicks here and going to see Peter Popov doing faith healing in London and using an undercover camera to catch him using a stooge. And generally talking about my weird personal experiences, throwing myself into investigating nonsense, really. But today I'm going to talk about something a bit different. I'm going to talk more systematically about the work we've been doing with the Good Thinking Society, the charity. And to speak at a conference that's about quackery and science and journalism is quite interesting for me, because I'm not a scientist. I don't have a science background. I did an English degree, but I do work for a charity that works in science all the time, that I'm a skeptical activist fighting pseudoscience. I'm kind of in that camp. I'm also not a journalist, really, although I have written for The Guardian and a couple of other new publications. I also occasionally teach journalism at a couple of universities, and I routinely work with journalists to source stories for them and to sort of place those into newspapers. So I'm sort of either in both camps or neither camp, depending on how you want to look at it, really. So yeah, I've been a skeptical activist since 2009, and since 2014 I was appointed the project director of the Good Thinking Society, so it's now my full-time job to be a skeptical activist. I think I'm the only skeptical investigator professionally in the UK, which is a very odd place to be. Part of my actual day job involves travelling around my country and occasionally around the world, essentially encouraging groups of strangers to doubt stuff, which is a very odd job to have. And when I tell people that's my job, I always get some people look at me as if to say, that's not really a job, is it? And to those people I would say, that's how good I am at making you doubt stuff, that you can doubt the validity of my own chosen career. We mentioned the 1023 campaign. Here it is right there, and the idea of this really was that we get people all around the country in the UK in 2010 to go into their local booths to buy some homeopathic sleeping pills, and then all together that morning they would take an overdose on these sleeping pills to prove that nobody falls asleep, nobody falls ill, these are just sugar pills, they should not be sold in pharmacies next to real medicine. And this got quite a lot of press coverage. This was front page story of the BBC for the day. It appeared in every national newspaper. And of course the homeopaths weren't particularly pleased about this. We got accused of being a publicity stunt, which was absolutely right. That's exactly what we were. We pretended nothing more than that. This wasn't science we were doing. This was cheerleading for science. This was pointing to the science that had already been done. Science knew for a century before this that homeopathy didn't work, but still people bought it. So clearly the science alone wasn't enough to demonstrate to people that homeopathy was not effective. We had to do something else. And so that's what this publicity stunt was really all about, to point people to the science that had been done. And so because we were just pointing people to the science, we then thought strategically about how do we get this message across to people? Because as skeptics, it's sometimes very easy for us to think there are believers and there are skeptics, like it's a 50-50 mix. But realistically, there might be 10-15% of people who believe in homeopathy, there might be 10-15% of people who know it's nonsense. The middle ground don't really know, don't really care, they might not have a clue what it was. Most people thought homeopathy was herbal medicine or natural medicine or traditional medicine. They had no idea that these pills were literally inert, these are just sugar pills. So we thought, rather than pointing people to the studies, which they're not going to read, the average person hasn't got the time to read the studies on every single piece of medicine or medical claim that comes across their path. And if we did point them to the studies, the homeopaths would point them to their own studies. And can the average person on the street tell a difference between a good study and a bad study? I'm not necessarily sure they can. And that's not necessarily to their detriment, because we've all got very busy lives. We don't have the time to pick up every single skill. So instead we thought, let's not point them to the science. Let's just give them the single most digestible piece of information you need to understand why homeopathy is nonsense. If we can tell them there's nothing in these sugar pills, most people will realise these can't possibly do anything. And so the strapline of the campaign was homeopathy, there's nothing in it. Everybody, as they took their overdose, would shout that before they swallowed their pills. And we took videos of all those overdoses, and we shared those with the journalists when we shared a press release, when we shared pictures, when we shared talking points. So we were really thinking about the strategic communication aspects of what we were doing, as well as doing this kind of publicity stunt. Even the name was very strategic. So we thought, because often when the media talk about homeopathy, they say, well, it's very dilute, it's ultra dilute, there's barely anything in it. They never say there's nothing in it. So we thought, how do we force the media to tell people there's nothing in homeopathy? So we named the campaign 1023 after the principle in chemistry, the Avogadro limit, which says the more you dilute something, you hit a point where you dilute it so much you can't find the original substance in any random sample that you take. That point is 6.02 times 10 to the 23. So we thought if we name our campaign 1023 after the Avogadro limit, and we do our overdoses at 1023 in the morning exactly after the Avogadro limit, when the media report on this, they can't ignore that weird number. They have to say what it means. And every single piece of press coverage included a line that says the campaign group, which is named after the chemical principle that proves there's nothing in homeopathy, did their overdose this morning. We crowbarred real science into the media reporting by thinking strategically about what we were trying to do. We also created a pack for the media that we'd send not just to every national newspaper, but to every local group to send to their local newspaper. And these included press releases that were effectively how we'd want the story to be reported. Not how we would report it, but how we'd expect to see it reported by a good journalist. Because we know that, as we were discussing yesterday, many journalists are quite junior. I think the biggest problem in journalism right now, I personally think, is the lack of funding. People think that you don't have to pay for journalism anymore, which means specialist reporters lose their jobs. Generalist reporters have to write 6, 7 stories a day. I think it's 7 or 8 if you're at the Daily Mail. They don't have the time to do the background check. They don't have the time to write the story properly. So if you write your press release the way you want a good journalist to have written your story, worst case scenario is they copy and paste your story directly. Best case scenario is a good journalist takes your story and improves it. So if you think about the way that you're communicating your story, you can really sort of take control of the narrative, really. So that was the 2010 campaign. By 2011, we thought, can we make this international? You can get in touch with every single skeptical group we can find in the world and see if they'll take part in this very odd, weird little idea that we had. And I spent about 6 months contacting people all around the world and flying to Budapest to meet skeptics from all over Europe. And this is what the 2011 campaign looked like. This is a video from the Cape Town overdose. Was anyone here in the Cape Town overdose? Are you still alive? Brilliant, it worked. Yes, so we got videos, we put those kind of videos up all on YouTube. Every one of those dots on the map is another homeopathic overdose all around the world. 1,700 people in 70 cities, 32 countries, 7 continents, including Antarctica. There was a research scientist from Australia who thought it'd be fun to do this in Antarctica, and it really was. The video was fantastic. And the effect of this little idea spread was kind of unprecedented. Something we could never have possibly anticipated. Because what we found was in Poland, after their 1023 campaign, sales of homeopathy dropped by 17%. Not because we were not because we were doing science, because we were just advertising the fact to people that homeopathy didn't work. I think in Brazil they even contemplated whether they would drop homeopathy from their health service. I think they actually did, at least for a while. And this was just a very simple little idea that anybody could have taken part in. It didn't need to have a science background, it didn't need to have a PhD to be involved. It was a simple and easily understandable idea. And the power of it was that we were all in it together on the same day at the same time. So that's what I was doing with the Merseyside Skeptics Society as a volunteer before this was my full-time job, and I've been moving on to other campaigns in the intermediary years. So I'm now with the Good Thinking Society. There's Simon Singh, who's the boss of the Good Thinking Society. Myself, I'm the only full-time employee, and my colleague Laura Thomason, who's a part-time employee with us. And that's the entire team these days, really. So when we have to choose our projects, we have to choose them quite carefully, because we aren't awash with resources. We've only got our time, really. And so we tend to look at where there are things where there's evidence of a real harm there, where there aren't many people already working on it, so we're not going to tread on toes or repeat work that's being done by someone else, and also where we think we can make an absolute difference. And I'd maybe also throw in there where the science is settled, where we're not working on contentious issues, we're really just pushing against an open door, because science has already found the answers on these particular things, but society hasn't caught up just yet. And that's really the type of products that we're working on. And I've rather grandiosely titled this presentation, Fighting Pseudoscience in the UK Establishment. So I should probably define what I mean by establishment. What I mean is, rather than looking at individual practitioners and saying this person over here is selling something that's wrong and we need to stop them, which we do, we also look more broadly at systematic flaws and where we can work with the big bodies in the UK. And that might be the NHS, the BBC, the state media, the state health service. So they have a public responsibility to spend their money effectively. Do I need that? Okay, sorry, I was confused there. Yeah, they don't have a responsibility to spend public money responsibly. Or it could be in regulatory bodies, so the regulators of veterinary surgeons, of osteopaths, of dentists, of chiropractors. These are government regulators who have a legal responsibility to regulate their industry. So if we can work with their regulations, we can start to spread good practice and try and weed out bad practice. You have the Charity Commission, which is the same thing for registered charities in the UK. And then you've got bodies like advertising standards, professional standards, the Medicine and Healthcare Regulatory Authority. These are the ones who will regulate advertising and medicine licensing, things like that. So this is what I mean by the establishment, the kind of the government-mandated bodies that are in charge of making sure people aren't making dodgy claims and that kind of thing. So the first kind of case study I'm going to take you through has probably been our biggest and most successful campaign over the last 4 years, and that is the provision of homeopathy on the NHS, which a lot of people get very kind of surprised about, that we even have homeopathy on the NHS. And really the reason that we have it is because when the NHS, the National Health Service, was brought in 1948, and a remarkable achievement that I think our government would do well to spend a little bit more money on and have a little bit more faith in. When that was brought in, there happened to be homeopaths involved in the committee to bring it in, and that's the reason it was kind of grandfathered into our system. We've got several homeopathic hospitals around the UK, which is a ludicrous concept in itself. And you kind of go there and get nothing for the whatever ails you. But the real problem when we started looking into this is people talk about the NHS funding homeopathy, but when we started this campaign, nobody actually knew how much money we were spending on homeopathy. Because it's nobody's job to have that figure. It's not like there is a department for homeopathy at the National Health Service. Every single funding decision is made locally around the country in one of 211 different bodies. And there was nobody's job at the NHS to ask all those bodies how much money they were spending and collect that figure. So literally nobody knew how much money of taxpayers' money was being wasted on something that the government even admitted didn't work. In 2010, they ran a big evidence-looking campaign and concluded, having looked at every single study that was presented to them, that there was no good evidence that homeopathy was effective and it should not be funded. And yet it was still being funded because they weren't telling the local authorities what to do. So the first thing I really did was spend 6 months sending freedom of information requests to all those local bodies and collating the figures. And what we found actually was 85% of the country did not fund homeopathy anyway. There was 14% of the country, 14 bodies in the country that did fund homeopathy, and a further 17 who didn't know whether they did or didn't fund it. And that's a very interesting category that unfortunately I don't have time to really go into the nuances of. So the majority of the country doesn't fund homeopathy, which is quite encouraging. We colour in a map to see where homeopathy is funded. It looks like this. So the majority does not, and you can see really it's very specified around a couple of locations. And the reason for that, if I put on the locations of the homeopathic hospitals in the UK, it's pretty clear that if you're near one of those hospitals, you can get homeopathy on the NHS. If you're not near them, you don't. So these hospitals really are key and central to the funding of homeopathy in my country, except in Newcastle, where it was this little weird outcrop of spending, which was a little weird for me because I grew up in Newcastle and I spent the last 15 years in Liverpool, and I promise you it's not my fault. It's not following me around. I'm not responsible for homeopathy in the UK. If I move to Bristol soon, then we will know that it's following me. But I'll show you the figures involved in each of those regions. You can see Newcastle was £230 a year, which is nothing, really, realistically. And it was maybe 1 or 2 patients who had previously had treatment, and it was the end of their treatment. So we weren't too worried about that. But you look to Bristol, it's £250,000. Scotland's £3 million. Scotland's £2 million rather. London's £3 million. We think there's a little a caveat around London because that's where they don't know whether they were or weren't funding it. They weren't 100% sure. So we were the first body in the UK to actually have the figures of how much we were spending on homeopathy. Whenever you see homeopathy mentioned in the British press and they quote the figure of £5 million, it's from my work. It's from the work we were doing with Good Thinking. But having that information isn't enough. It's not just enough to have the right answers if you don't tell people about it and if you don't try and do something with that. I think one of the key messages that we'd like to get across is communication of your work and communication of the right ideas is absolutely key to skepticism. It's not enough to just be right. We have to try and help other people understand what's going on too. So the first thing we did was start looking at contracts where homeopathy was being refunded, where contracts were being re-signed to be continue to be funded around the country. And the first one that came up was in my hometown of Liverpool. And we found something quite interesting in Liverpool. So in early 2014, they had this big review that looked at whether they should carry on funding homeopathy, and they came to the conclusion they needed to stop. And they put this out to the public and said, what do you think about this? And no member of the public disagreed. So obviously what Liverpool did was carry on funding it anyway. And we said, you can't do that because you're spending public money, you have a responsibility, a legal responsibility to spend that well. So you need to go back and relook at this decision, or effectively we'll take you to court over this because this is a misuse of public funds. So in February, February 2015, we threatened to take Liverpool to court because we thought they were going against the law in terms of the way they were using public funds. And as a result, in April 2015, they conceded. And in December, they started a new consultation to go back to square one and start again. But this time they had to do it properly because they knew we were watching. Previously, the only people who might have threatened to pick up a fuss if the decision went against him would have been the homeopaths, the people who make their money out of homeopathy, the bodies that represent homeopaths. They've got the money, the time, and the single issue interest to spend all their time looking at this. So that's largely, we think, possibly why this decision was put through originally, because they thought, well, if we get rid of it, we're going to have a lot of grief from the homeopaths. But we were there to say, actually, the skeptics are also interested in this. So you have to do this responsibly and right, because you have to be able to defend this. And so because this new consultation was opened, we were able to work with skeptics in Liverpool, we were able to write to doctors in Liverpool, to health professionals, and to say, this consultation's opened, and it's there for you to share your thoughts. What do you think Liverpool should do about funding homeopathy? And as a result, in June 2016, they made a decision to stop funding homeopathy. They stopped the funding as a direct result of the work that we did with the Good Thinking Society. And we found some quite interesting stuff out. 74% of people who responded to this said they wouldn't use homeopathy. 73% said they didn't want it funded. I'm not sure what the 1% difference is. It's quite a strange position to be in. But we thought the majority of people who would respond to this would actually be homeopaths, would be people who are on board with this. So we were really encouraged by a groundswell of support for our campaign. And if you look at just the people from Liverpool and not the ones who said they were outside of Liverpool, even then 64% of people, the majority of people in that town said they didn't want it funded. And what was encouraging is that was just the first domino to fall. A couple of months later, the Wirral, which is a neighbour of Liverpool, went through exactly the same process, and they stopped funding homeopathy in 2016, in October 2016 too. This finished homeopathy in the northwest of England completely by this point. Since then, other CCGs have started doing exactly the same thing. The CCG is the local NHS body who's in control of that particular area. So you've got, this is the Bristol area. All the ones in the Bristol area are undergoing a similar kind of review. On the right, on the left there, we've got Enfield, which is in London, and they are now starting to go through the same procedure. Enfield has just announced last month that they're not going to fund homeopathy anymore. So here's kind of what's happened in the couple of years since our campaign started. What we found is 14 of those bodies have stopped funding homeopathy. A further 4 at least are reviewing their funding, and all of the CCGs in London are taking steps now to end homeopathy funding. It's not all directly as a result of our work, but we've certainly had a big hand in it. In Bristol, costs have fallen by 30%, but most importantly, the homeopathic hospital has closed. The Liverpool Homeopathic Hospital has closed. These are the anchors around which funding is held on the NHS. Once these are starting to go, then we should hopefully see that start to really dry up. That's direct funding. That's when your GP sends you to a homeopath. But your GP can write you a prescription that you take to a pharmacy and get homeopathy that way. So we thought we needed to tackle that side of homeopathy too. So what we found in the law, and looking through the regulations, working with our legal team that we work with, is that there's a thing called the NHS blacklist, the Schedule 1 blacklist, which is a list of 3,000 products that pharmacists aren't allowed to give you on prescription, that you can't get a prescription for, they're banned. And some of them are things that you could just buy yourself. So things like suntan lotion you can't get a prescription for because that'd be far too expensive to the government when you can go and buy it for relatively little. And to be honest, in the UK, we barely ever need it, to be honest. So you've got 3,000 things. And there's a list of criteria under which things can be added to this list. And that list might be, if it's not effective, it can be banned. If it's less effective than something that's already available, it can be banned. If it's prohibitively expensive, it can be banned. So there's a list of criteria. You only need to fulfill one criteria to be on that list. Homeopathy met 4 of the criteria. The only criteria that could apply to homeopathy met. So we argued to the Department of Health, you have a legal duty to maintain this list. Homeopathy, we think, meets all the laws. You have to put it on the list. The Department of Health initially refused. We said, well, you can't really refuse because we're reading the law here and we think the law is right. We understand that your position is we don't think you're allowed to do this. And we got to a position where we actually threatened to take the Department of Health to court over this. Threatened to effectively sue the government over their refusal to think about putting homeopathy on this blacklist. That was June 2015. In September, they told us they'd reconsider their decision not to put it on there. And in fact, in November, they said they were going to have a formal review, a public review that people could submit their own personal thoughts and feelings to, and they would consider all that. And they announced that in November and said it would take place in June 2016. Unfortunately, something else significant happened in June 2016 in my country that rendered us without a government and has largely had those repercussions ever since. But in June 2017, the review did open. And again, we got in touch with skeptics all around the country, with doctors, with people involved in charities, to say, how do you want your NHS money spent? Do you want it spent on something that the government admits doesn't work, or do you want to save that money to spend on stuff that does work? Because it's a limited pool of resources, and we have to choose what we fund. So we think we shouldn't be funding things that don't work. And in October 2017, the review closed, and we're expecting answers by the end of this year as to what the Department of Health are going to do on this. And we're looking forward to getting those answers because we think, looking at the way that the law works, we think we've got a very strong position here. That's the work that we were doing, but we're also making sure that we did this work in public. We kept a spotlight on it because it's not just enough to have the right answers, we also want to get plenty of attention to it. And the coverage of our homeopathy campaign has been pretty significant over the last couple of years. We tend to be published in the press once every week on average over the past 3 years, which for a body the size of ours, where we have one full-time employee and one part-time employee, that's quite a remarkable achievement, I think. And we also try and go right across the British press. We don't try and just stick to The Guardian, where people might already agree with us, but we try and put different stories in different newspapers. We aim for The Sun and The Mirror and the more working-class papers because people might not usually get science into those papers. Now, the science correspondents in those papers might not exist because they've cut corners, they've cut costs, they've laid off special journalists. But because we know how to write the stories the way that we'd expect to see them in the press and make the stories as accessible as possible to the journalists, even a general journalist can publish stories on on the things that we're doing. So I think we've really got a good penetration into the UK press. And what's significant about this is when I started the 1023 campaign, we often found that the media were very credulous about homeopathy. We don't find that now. We find most coverage of homeopathy is negative. And we're not the only reason that that's changed, but we're certainly part of the tide turning. As an aside, actually talking about this kind of stuff and thinking about what we were looking at yesterday, I think one of the most significant problems that we have in science journalism is a failure by journalists to understand that health stories are science stories. You'll see stories coming across a science correspondent's desk and they'll cover them fantastically. But if those same stories, and there'll be other stories that just get completely rejected by a science correspondent, but if those stories that get rejected go to a general journalist, they might not realise they're bullshit. And we saw this actually with during the last Olympics. Michael Phelps of the US swim team was covered in rings from cupping, sort of ancient Chinese, not that ancient actually, but sort of acupressure pseudoscience that has no effect at all. And there was this very long, very credulous, very praising story in the BBC about it. And I actually called the health editor of the BBC, because we work pretty closely with James Gallagher, who's the health editor, and said, what the hell is the BBC doing praising cupping? And he said he never saw that story, because it didn't look like a health story, so it never got sent to the health desk. It looked like a celebrity story, or a lifestyle story, or a sports story. And we see that right across the press. So I think that's a major issue, is journalists aren't always good at identifying what is a science story and then making sure it goes to a science correspondent. There are plenty of stories that just go to a general journalist because they don't smell like science stories to journalists. And often it's the health and lifestyle type of ones where a celebrity says they're using homeopathy to cure their eczema. It doesn't seem like a science story, it sounds like a celebrity story, but it's a science story. As a result of a lot of the media attention that we've had, we've seen other things happening. And one of the biggest and most significant is the advances in veterinary homeopathy. So veterinary homeopathy is relatively prominent in the UK. Here's a few examples of it here. That's BBC's Farming Today, the flagship farming radio programme is listened to by every farmer. Here they are praising homeopathy. We've got the British Homeopathic Association talk about treating animals in homeopathy. And there's a case study of treating cancer in animals with homeopathy that was supported by homeopaths too. There aren't that many vets who believe in homeopathy. Of the 22,000 vets, it's maybe only about 50. But the UK isn't very big. So if there's 50 vets relatively spread around the UK, you might be an hour's drive from your nearest homeopathic vet. So even though there's a small number, they can have quite a large impact, kind of ironically, I suppose. And obviously animals are subjected to avoidable harm if they're given homeopathy instead of genuine treatment that can help. And it also undermines the trust in veterinary science. When you have one vet giving homeopathy, the next vet saying homeopathy doesn't work, the public just see two vets. How do they know who to believe? I think it kind of has a view of veterinary science that's unhelpful to people understanding what's going on. And it also lends credibility to homeopathy. So often when we were doing our NHS campaign, we found people saying, well, homeopathy must work because it works on animals. So if we could take out the peg of people believing that it worked on animals and take away the support for it in animal care, it would actually help us with taking support away in human care. And also, I think the veterinary homeopathy would be a good delivery mechanism for skepticism because people have a lot of sympathy for animals. The media has a lot of sympathy for animals. And I think it fits to a theory that I often kind of talk about, which is the media hierarchy of sympathies. The media always want to show the story from the underdog's perspective. So if you have a practitioner of herbal medicine and they're being censored by the government, The practitioner is the underdog. The government is the big, evil, overbearing body, and they'll often tell it from that practitioner's point of view. But for us as activists and scientists, if we can find the victims who've been harmed by those practitioners, the media now see the victims, the practitioner is the bad guy, and we're the whistleblowers. So we can shift the direction of the stories. And I think it's very easy for the media to see animals as the sympathetic victims here, partly because they don't have agency themselves in what they choose to have, and also because you can put pictures of little cute kittens on there, and it's very hard not to feel warm towards them. So veterinary homeopathy was an important issue for us, and because of the work that we've done in the press advertising our blacklisting work, we found there were a couple of vets who were looking to do the same thing in homeopathy. And one of them was a chap called Danny Chambers. He's the one on the left, not the one on the right in that picture. And he'd started a petition to get people to ban veterinary homeopathy. And he was trying to get people to sign this petition. We thought, brilliant, here is a vet, an expert in his field, looking to do something that will change his field for the better. How do we support him? How do we work with experts, but use our media expertise, our campaigning expertise, to boost his profile, to boost his work? So first of all, we got him some very positive media coverage. We had him writing pieces in the New Scientist and the Guardian, talking about why this is an important issue. And we spent time trying to get more and more people involved in this. So we wrote to vets across the UK to say, do you believe that this is an important thing? Could you sign this? Because having more and more vets sign this petition will increase the power of it. We wrote to people who are pet owners to say, do you want your pet to get the best care? Because if so, your pet shouldn't be getting homeopathy from your vet. So all the way through our campaign, we were getting very positive media coverage. Even the Daily Mail, which again typically wouldn't give positive coverage to this kind of story. But with the Daily Mail, I was very happy to get it in there. I often try and place stories in the Daily Mail. I've got what I like to call the Newton's cradle of media bullshit when it comes to Daily Mail, which is if you can push a good story in the Daily Mail, you might knock a bad story out the other side through momentum. So I always like to try and get it in the Daily Mail there. And as a result of, there is Danny, the vet that we're working with, on BBC Breakfast, which is the flagship TV news programme in the morning on BBC. So it was very high profile, top story on the BBC website for the day. And as a result of the attention that we brought and the work that we did putting this campaign together, there were some very positive outcomes. First of all, Danny was elected to the policy board of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. So he's now in a place to help influence the way that veterinary policy works. This latest round of elections, several people who were working with Danny on this evidence-based medicine quest in veterinary medicine were elected to that board. And several homeopaths weren't. This is the first time in decades that there's no homeopathic vet on the veterinary board. So we could see genuine progress being made. This was earlier this year. And actually, we've already seen some great progress being made, because the Veterinary Surgeon, which is the official academic paper of the Veterinary Society, did a meta-analysis of homeopathic trials in animal care and released their results, which actually made the national news, to say actually there's no evidence at all that homeopathy is effective. This was a major meta-analysis put out by a veterinary surgeon. So this is now starting to show the tide turning as a result of some of the work we've done and fantastic activists like Danny and his colleagues. And actually literally last week, the Royal College got together and put together a new position statement on homeopathy, which was, you should not support it as a vet, we won't support it. And it even went as far as to say that if a vet gives an animal homeopathy without giving it conventional care, that vet can be subject to disciplinary proceedings. So we could genuinely see things really starting to move in the veterinary homeopathy world and move for the better. So that's some of the work we've been doing with regulators there. We've also worked regulating charities. So we've got about just over 200,000 charities in the UK. And to be a charity, you get tax benefits, which is obviously quite important. But you also get a sense of credibility. When people donate to charities, they think this is an important thing. This is for the public good. Because to be a registered charity, you have to act in the public benefit. That is the charity law. So everyone would see a charity, they should think that all charities are acting in the public good. And yet we have charities whose sole purpose is the promotion of pseudoscience. And promoting pseudoscience can't possibly be in the public benefit. So we've got charity law that actually says if you're not in the public benefit, you should not be a registered charity. And we've got the Charity Commission, which is the body that regulates charities. And some of these charities are actually pretty egregious. So for example, you've got the Mourne Homeopathy Project. This is the charitable aims of the Mourne Homeopathy Project as they describe themselves in their charity register. The Mourne Homeopathy Project provides a free homeopathic service for women, men and children living with HIV and AIDS or traumatised by rape in Mourne, Botswana. This is giving homeopathy to people with HIV. It's enormously dangerous, But the UK government is effectively subsidising this through tax benefits and lending credibility by allowing them to be a charity. We also have charities like the Vaccine Awareness Network, whose website address is the Vaccine Risk Awareness website. And you can see some of the headlines on of articles on this website. Your immune system and how it works and why vaccines damage it. Did vaccines really halt killer diseases? Autism and cerebral palsy from the DPT vaccine. This is clearly an anti-vaccine charity. Now, where I live in Liverpool in the UK, we've had measles outbreaks quite significantly. And we have Public Health England, who are spending a reasonable amount of public money to try and raise the vaccination rates by pointing out the importance of vaccines. And yet, at the same time, the government is also effectively subsidising anti-vaccination charities. This is not a sustainable or responsible position. Now, there have been some people who've been working on this, who'd actually been writing to the Charities Commission, making complaints and trying to deal with the regulatory process that the Charities Commission are legally bound to follow. And they've had very little success, really. They've been going around in circles for a little while. So we thought, how do we go and how do we boost their profile? How do we put more weight behind their work? How do we use our activism and our media skills to try and put more attention and spotlight on this issue? And the first thing we did was we wrote an open letter, which was co-signed by 11 health professionals to say, this is a really important issue and the Charity Commission has to take their regulatory responsibilities seriously. And there's the letter in the Sunday Times, and there it is also in the Daily Mail. So we start to really shine a light on this and make it much harder for regulators to avoid doing their duty in the darkness. And then in September, we highlighted that if the Charity Commission weren't willing to do what the charity law said they were willing to do, they could be taken to court over this. They could face a judicial review, a legal case, over their failure to uphold charity law. And we said, we're willing to take you to court over this, which is a very odd position for us to be in as a registered charity, where we're effectively threatening to sue the charities regulator, our own regulator. It was a very odd day in Good Thinking headquarters when we decided that was a wise thing to do. But that was September 2016, and literally about a week or so later, they committed to a full review of their policy and how they apply their policy to quack charities. That consultation took place in March 2017. So again, we were able to know that that consultation was taking place, to engage with people who might be interested in it, to get doctors and health professionals and other charities to write in and say, this is what you should do when it comes to charities that are not acting in the public benefit. This is how we think charity law should be applied and why we think it's important. So hopefully they're not just going to hear from the supporters of those charities, but they'll hear from a broader set of voices in the UK society and understand why this is an important issue. So there's our submission to it, but as well as actually encouraging people to take part, again, we tried to get plenty of media coverage to ensure that people understood why this was an important thing, why we were doing it, why we felt this was something that needed attention. The results are due soon. That consultation closed in October, and we're told that we'll get the results of it in December. So I'm hoping that they make a sensible step. And if they do make a sensible step to say, we're going to actually uphold the law, because that's what we're meant to do, and here's how we're going to apply the law, we can then start seeing, hopefully, some of these quack charities losing their charitable status. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to have to disband as an organisation. They can carry on. They just can't be a charity anymore. They can't have tax breaks. They can't have donations. They can't walk around with a registered charity number looking credible when what they're doing is not in the public good. So we're hoping to see a positive outcome there too. Then we have the healthcare regulators of other industries. So we have, I've got to sort of move a little quicker. So we've been working a lot with looking at chiropractors. So we have the General Chiropractic Council, which is the state regulator of chiropractors. They're there to protect the public. They have a legal obligation to investigate complaints. But chiropractors make misleading claims, and there's the very famous case of Simon Singh pointing out that chiropractors are claiming to treat colic, which there's no evidence they can do, and they actually tried to sue Simon over that. So we thought, well, are chiropractors still trying to say they can treat colic? So the first thing we did was look at 100 chiropractors' websites and see where they're making misleading claims, like saying they're a doctor when they're a doctor of chiropractic, not a medical doctor, when they're saying they'll treat colic or whiplash. What we found of the 100 chiropractic websites that my colleague Laura looked at, 82 of them were making claims that they could not substantiate and were not compliant with advertising law. So we called 10 of these chiropractors and said, can you treat colic? And half of them said, yeah, absolutely, bring your baby in, we'll treat colic. So we complained to the GCC initially, say, this isn't right, you need to regulate this. They didn't really investigate our complaints. We didn't feel they were taking us seriously. So we said, okay, we're going to make 25 complaints every single month, until you show that you're willing to do your job properly. because you have a legal mandate to regulate, a legal mandate to investigate these complaints. By the end of the year, they had 300 complaints to investigate. They closed 4, they referred 15 to the Advertising Standards Authority, and 281 are even now still waiting response. But we have met with them, and the Advertising Standards have published guidance on how chiropractors can advertise what they can and can't say, and we're carrying on in that area. I'll skip through a similar story with the osteopaths, exactly the same kind of thing. So what are the osteopaths doing? They've got a regulator, the Osteopathic Council. They're making claims they can't substantiate. So we surveyed a number of their websites. We found 1 in 3 of them were making claims they couldn't substantiate. We looked at 100 sites a month throughout 2015, it was the same. Then we started calling osteopaths and found actually every single one of them would either say they could treat colic or that they could recommend someone who could. So clearly this is endemic throughout their industry. We complained to the GOSC. Our complaints weren't really investigated, so we said you'll get 25 complaints a month until you take us seriously. Pretty quickly, they issued new guidance to all their members to say you can't claim to treat colic. You have to have evidence for your health claims. You can't say things you can't actually do. And actually a little while later, they released further guidance saying you can't even imply it. So you can't avoid saying the word colic, but say a very restless baby who can't sleep. We all know what you mean. You're not allowed to say it. Now, of our complaints, the majority of them were actually closed after an investigation where they said that the websites and these chiropractors stopped making those claims. We've looked, we don't think those websites are compliant, so we don't think it's actually as positive as the GOSC have said, but they are taking some action. And there are signs that it's improving. So when we started, about 1 in 3 were making claims they couldn't substantiate. Now when we look, it's about 1 in 6. So it looks like our work is having a salutary effect on misleading claims in the chiropractic and osteopathic industries there. We've met with both organisations. They haven't seemed willing or able to do to work on the majority of our complaints, and they've been referring to the Advertising Standards Agency. But they're both regulated by another agency, the Professional Standards Authority. So if they aren't doing their job properly, we can start working with the PSA to try and have the GCC and the GOSC censure for not doing their job, and that's where we're currently looking at the moment. I'll skip through the media reporting stuff, but we actually work looking at what how the BBC report on stories to make sure they're not injecting false balance into stories or promoting things they absolutely shouldn't be. And we've had a number of complaints upheld about BBC programming when they were promoting an alternative health magazine on a major radio show, when they're promoting homeopathy on Farming Today, when they're promoting animal chiropractic on a local news programme. All of these were upheld. And when a complaint is upheld within the BBC, it gets disseminated through the organisation to producers and journalists, so they understand what they can and can't do. And we think this has a salutary effect on misleading claims in future. There was actually a time on very recently where BBC Today, the flagship radio news programme, had a climate change denier on the show, and we made a complaint. Not only was that complaint upheld, it made national news. The producers of that show are not going to make that mistake again, and we're hoping to carry on working with them. We've also met with the Professional Standards Director of the BBC to explain why these are concerns and to have things passed down from the top. The final thing I'll show is just the work we're looking at in terms of advertising. So working with the Advertising Standards Authority. This is everything except the chiropractors and osteopaths, where there are hundreds and hundreds of complaints. We've made 42 in the last couple of years. 2 of them were formally upheld. 17 were resolved in the sense that the advertiser changed as a result of what we did, so they didn't have to be put on the naughty step and embarrassed in public. 13 have been passed to the team within the advertising standards who can actually enforce things further. So we've actually got a fairly good record there. So, just to summarise, we've been working with regulation. We've been trying to go into the letter of the law and understand how that affects things and how we can use that to have a broader, wide-reaching effect rather than necessarily targeting just individual practitioners. How do we target an entire industry? Not all the regulators have seemed enthusiastic about doing their job, but that's why we can then look to the people who regulate the regulators and bring legal cases if they refuse to do their legal job. We've been taking a systematic approach, planning media strategy into the campaign to ensure that we're communicating what we're doing so that the public understand these areas, so that we're not ceding the ground to the pseudoscientists to tell their story and we say nothing and the public don't really understand what we're doing. We're trying to put that central to what we're doing. And it does seem like we're having an effect across many areas of alternative health industry in the UK. And yeah, we intend to continue doing so. Thank you.